There's a thing. It's rotating.
Nickel 613, Roger. Roger, there's shooting.
We are being visited and have been visited for many years by people from outer space, from other civilizations.
Were you ever read into, were you ever briefed about a crash retrieval program for UFOs? And there's this really long pause. Yes.
No way.
But I was never read out of it. So there's not much I can tell you.
People see the unidentified flying object. That's beyond question.
Big Pope, what do you believe now that you didn't believe 5 years ago?
I came into the job as a skeptic, but I was convinced by the sheer weight of evidence, the sightings, the radar evidence, all that sort of thing, that some of these things that we see in the sky and call UFOs are extraterrestrial in origin.
My personal belief is that there's very compelling evidence that we may not be alone, whatever that means.
Who is in charge here? If Secretaries of Defense aren't being briefed in on this, if the Presidents of the United States are not being briefed in on this, if the heads of Senate Intelligence Committees are not being briefed in on this, who is it that's briefed in on this? Who is it that's doing the briefing in on this? You know, that exists somewhere, and that's the key to this thing.
They were concerned with panic in 52. They were concerned with technology as well, and they didn't know the motivation of the aliens. What do you tell the public? There are these guys coming here, they got technology we don't have, we can't do anything about it, but we thought you might want to know so you can go panic off in the street.
And I talked to those pilots, and they know they saw something, and their radars locked onto it. And then all of a sudden it was here on the surface, and then it's there. And they don't know what it is, and we don't know what it is.
But if it's what we call an other, we are debriefed, we turn in our clothing, and we place all evidence in special containers and burn bags, and the incident never happened. He has done that with as many as 180 people in the basement, some of them really frightened. One of them sent out a flash message because he could not believe the quote-unquote thing that showed up at their base one day. All right, so I'm not going to say any more about that.
December 13th, 1944. Commander of Allied forces in Europe, Dwight Eisenhower, nearly a decade before he's elected president, issues a press release acknowledging that unidentified objects are interacting with Allied planes called Foo Fighters.
Foo Fighters is the name given to strange balls of light that were seen by pilots during the Second World War. Now, if you actually drill down into some of the detailed reports, you see very clearly that some pilots were talking about structured craft. There were sightings from US and UK pilots. So, of course, the thinking was at first this was some sort of Axis secret weapon. Maybe the Nazis or the Japanese had developed something.
Some of these lights would get close enough that they actually seemed to cause engine malfunctions and disturbances until they would move away and often just shoot up into the sky. So the question is, what were these things? To this day, there's not a really clear explanation to what they were.
which is used by some 3 million.
Did the Joint Chiefs of Staff talk to you or concern you about the unknown and the unidentified flying object?
Oh, yes, we discussed it at every conference that we had with the military, and they never were able to make me a concrete report on.
Do you have anything on the subject, sir?
No, I haven't anything on the subject, and there's always things like that going on.
We saw a globular object approximately 5 miles ahead of us. At first, the frontal cross-section area of this object was so small that I thought it was an aircraft with a highly swept-backed wing. But as it got closer to us and below us, it was obvious that it had no wings at all. And I then considered it to be a meteorological balloon. After it passed us by, from first to last sight, it was approximately 10 seconds, and it then occurred to me that the speed of closing was so great that it couldn't possibly be a free balloon. I have no idea what it could be, and I passed the report to London Airways.
How big was the object?
Well, it's very difficult to assess the size of any object while it's flying. All I can say, the closest I can get to it, is that it was smaller than a Viscount.
Was it traveling at any great speed?
Well, the closing speed of both the object and my own aircraft was up in the region of 1,000 miles an hour, which means that the object itself must have been doing at least 600 to 700 miles an hour.
Were there any windows in it?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Was it powered in any way?
Well, it must have been powered. A free balloon we would only approach it at the speed of our own aircraft, which is 300 miles an hour. So it must have been powered. The speed of closing was much too great for it to be a free balloon.
Did anybody else witness the object?
Yes, First Officer Murphy, my co-pilot.
The United States Air Force, in discharging its responsibility for the aerospace defense of the nation, is called upon to investigate reports of unidentified flying objects. 2 Air Force officers have over the years been very closely associated with this activity. Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Stacker was formerly the chief spokesman for the Air Force on the matter, and Major Hector Quintanilla is now the chief of Project Blue Book. Major Quintanilla, what are the objectives of Project Blue Book?
The objectives of the program are twofold. They're the same as they have been since 1953 when the regulations were written. First of all, to try to determine if the UFO phenomena presents a threat to the security of the United States. And second, to determine if the UFO phenomena exhibits any technological advances which could be turned into research and development.
What's the record so far?
To date, we have over 10,000 cases at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, of which 646 of these remain unidentified. That's not to say that we could not have identified more cases if we had gotten to the observer quickly and checked the local activity.
The Air Force has been accused from time to time of hiding information about UFO. What do you have to say to that, Colonel Patton?
Well, these charges are absolutely untrue. Actually, the United States Air Force releases statistics on the UFO phenomena through the Department of Defense press desk periodically, and we've always honored accredited media when they want to investigate a given specific sighting.
There's nothing to hide?
There's nothing to hide at all.
Is there anything in the files, either classified or unclassified, that would indicate that there may be extraterrestrial visitors over here?
First of all, the project is completely unclassified. And there is nothing in the records which would indicate that we have been visited by any advanced civilization.
How does the Air Force look upon people who make reports of UFO? Do they look on them as qualified observers?
Yes, they do look on them as qualified observers. Actually, most people who report a UFO sighting are patriotic citizens who have been mystified by something that they've seen, and through a patriotic sense, report it to the local law enforcement officials or to the United States Air Force Base near them.
What would you consider as a person qualified to interpret what he sees?
Well, I consider astronomers are genuinely expert in their field. First of all, they have a tremendous advantage over the other physical scientists, and that is that they have powerful telescopes and photographic equipment to confirm their interpretation.
Do astronomical laboratories make any contribution to the UFO program?
In a negative way they do, because I've never received a UFO report from an observatory.
Not a one?
Not a single one.
Well, how about the tracking and detection facilities that the Air Force itself has? How does this fit the program?
Well, actually, to begin with, the United States Air Force is charged by an act of Congress with the air defense of the United States. And the North American Air Defense Command and the Air Defense Command have space tracking facilities which are constantly on the alert 24 hours a day. We're interested in anything that flies in our atmosphere.
Well, how about UFO reports in other countries? How are they handled?
Well, UFOs actually occur worldwide. However, the United States is the only country in the world that places as much emphasis on the phenomenon. Other countries place a burden of proof on the observer and not on their Air Force.
And that would make your job a lot easier if they did that here.
Yes, it would.
Thank you, Colonel Tucker, Major Quintanilla. I would like to close by reading a very brief excerpt from the report of the Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board, which they made recently upon completing a detailed review of the subject of UFO. This is a statement. The committee concluded that in the 19 years since the first UFO was sighted, there has been no evidence that unidentified flying objects are a threat to our national security.
This is the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. And this man is Colonel Bill Coleman. He was Chief of Public Information for the United States Air Force from 1969 to 1974.
It was here at the Pentagon that the Defense Department first became interested in the UFO phenomenon. This occurred in the late 1940s, with reports about objects and lights seen in the sky by military personnel and others. The Air Force decided to investigate the matter anyway. There was that one possibility that these flying objects could well be foreign weapons used for test purposes and might affect our national security. The investigative branch was called Project Sign. The project had only been underway for about 2 weeks when the Mantell crash had made headlines across the nation. The staff's investigation was far from complete, but public pressure was enormous, and they were forced to come up with an answer to really quiet growing speculation that Mantell had been killed by hostile aliens in some flying saucer. That's when we decided that Mantell had chased the planet Venus. However, this was an initial finding. The Chills and Whitted case had an impact on the Air Force project. It presented the first close-up account by highly reliable witnesses. The object described led some of the staff to postulate an extraterrestrial theory, and they wrote up an estimate of the situation, which at the time was classified top secret, suggesting that the saucers were from outer space. This theory was rejected by the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Hoyt Vandenberg, and even other Project Sign staff members as not having enough proof. So the extraterrestrial visitation idea was dropped for the time being.
It's been said in jest that if these UFOs are from other worlds and they wanted it to be known, all they'd have to do is land on the White House lawn. But an incredible incident, too quickly forgotten in time, took place over our Capitol. In 1952, Air Force spokesman for the Pentagon and UFOs at that time, Mr. Al Chop, relates the famous incident that stirred the Capitol, causing a request from even President Truman to be kept up to date on all the details.
There were radar reports of unidentified flying objects over the nation's capital. We had 3 reports. One came from Andrews Air Force Base radar control room, and 2 from the radar controls at Washington National Airport. The first sightings consisted of a number of unidentified targets picked up on radar. Then a call was placed from National to the Andrews Air Force Base flight controllers. They were apparently tracking the same targets. Then Andrews reported a visual observation of 3 objects that were apparently in the same position as those indicated by our radar sets. The target stayed on radar until about 12:30 a.m.
They moved slowly at first, about 100 to 200 miles per hour. Then one of the targets sped away at a fantastic rate of speed. It moved west from Andrews toward Riverdale.
Army 142.
The estimated speed was 7,300 miles per hour. At this time, in the tower, we had about 7 targets on the radar scope. These unidentified objects were flying all over the city. They even violated the restricted air corridors here over the White House and over the Capitol building.
The phenomena wasn't to subside. The following Saturday night, July 26th, a repeat performance unsettles the Capitol again.
I was awakened the following Saturday night around midnight by a telephone call to my home in Virginia. It was the public information officer for the Federal Aviation Authority. He told me the air traffic control radars were again picking up a large number of UFOs over the Capitol area. First, they would follow a definite flight path, and then they would suddenly disappear. Others would come into view just as suddenly. I placed a phone call to the command post in the Pentagon, and I asked for an intercept. About 2:40 a.m., we got a radio call from a flight of F-94s, 2 aircraft in the flight. They also, at about that moment, appeared on our scope. And at that moment, a very frightening thing happened to us. All of our unknown traffic completely disappeared the moment those aircraft came on the scope. The flight leader called in and said, well, it doesn't look like we're going to do any good here, so we're going to go back to base. And at the very moment those aircraft disappeared, all of our unknown traffic appeared again on our scope. And again, it was a very frightening experience. We called Andrews Air Force Base, and they reported exactly the same thing happened to their scope.
10 a.m. on the morning after the sighting, General Landry, at the request of President Truman, called intelligence to find out what was happening over Washington.
It was the largest and longest press conference held in the Pentagon since World War II.
General Samford headed the conference and said that he was personally satisfied that the radar scope sightings were the result of temperature inversions, which are known and account for certain blips on radar. Although this was the conclusion of the Air Force investigations, interestingly enough, the actual report begins with this opening comment: a study of the various reports regarding the subject. Radar sightings do not allow a positive and final explanation to be made. The CIA now would enter the picture by convening a panel of top scientists to examine the UFO phenomena. The CIA's concern was that recent waves of sightings might constitute a threat to our national security. The thinking was that the enemy could exploit UFOs as a decoy in the preparation for an attack on the United States. 5 outstanding scientists and various Air Force and CIA representatives were to meet on Wednesday, January 14th, 1953. Among the panel members was one associate member who was destined to have more experience with the UFO phenomena than any other American scientist to date, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, astrophysicist and head of the astronomy department of Northwestern University.
I was called into the meeting on Thursday. The panel members were seated around this table. It was a rather somber and impressive occasion, actually. I was a junior member, and I remember feeling considerably nervous and apprehensive about being in front of this powerhouse of scientists. But then for the past 4 years, I had been scientific advisor to the U.S. Air Force on this very problem. There were 2 films that were of particular interest to the panel at that time. One was a film taken by a Navy officer while on vacation in Utah, near Tremonton, Utah, and the other was a film taken in Great Falls, Montana, by the owner of the local baseball team. The Utah film had already been subjected to some 1,000 or so man-hours of analysis by the Navy's Photographic Interpretation Laboratory. So the panel got up from their chairs and crouched around the wall to examine the films, and they asked to have the films run several times, as a matter of fact. Now, the Navy had, on the basis of their detailed analysis, of the Utah films, they had concluded that the objects shown in the films could not be birds, balloons, aircraft, and so forth, but indeed that they were self-luminous, unidentified objects. Despite this conclusion, the panel rejected it and concluded that the objects were birds. They couldn't be unidentified, therefore they had to be birds. I came away from the meeting and from the room with the distinct feeling, however, that the panel had deliberately moved to debunk the whole subject and not to give it the serious scientific attention which it deserved.
In 1966, congressional hearings were held with Secretary of Defense Harold Brown and scientific advisor of Project Blue Book, Dr. J. Allen Hynek.
What is the Air Force hiding in this investigation? We have not been hiding anything. The investigations have been made public. The explanations of those where there is a clear explanation have been made public. The hearing this morning was public for just that reason.
None of the evidence that I have examined would indicate any proof at all that we are being visited by extraterrestrials.
I was there at Blue Book, and I know the job they had. They were told not to excite the public. Don't rock the boat. And I saw it in my own eyes happen that whenever a case happened that they could explain, which is quite a few, they made point of that and let that out to the media. Things that the cases that were very difficult to explain, they would jump handsprings to keep the media away from it. For they had a job to do, to, whether rightfully or wrongly, to keep the public from getting excited.
You said you saw literally hundreds of unidentifiable flying objects.
Yes, they were flying quite high. How high we couldn't tell because we couldn't get anywhere near their altitude. But they were either very large craft way up or smaller craft still well above what we could get to.
For a day and a half, all of this happened. But then no one wanted to talk about it.
Well, we sent a report forward on it, and the answer that finally came back months later was they were probably high-flying seed pods, which didn't sound very logical.
Supervising flight testing at Edwards Air Force Base, his military camera crew actually filmed an unidentified saucer-shaped object landing near the site.
As they were sitting there filming, a little saucer came from, I say little saucer, it was a saucer, came flying over their heads, put down 3 little landing gear and landed right out on the dry lake bed. And they picked up their cameras and started over toward it, filming as they went. And when they got in fairly close to it, it lifted up, put the gear back in the wheel wells, tipped up, and took off at a great rate of speed. And so they came into my office and told me what had happened, and I sent them over to develop the film. And then had to go through all the proper regulations of reporting this, and we wound up having to send the film forward to Washington in the base jet airplane, and I don't know whether anyone's ever seen it since.
Now, the vehicle that you just described, how similar was it to the very first sighting that you had back in 1951?
Quite similar. It was basically the same planform vehicle. They were double saucer, lenticular. But if you're going to be going in and out of atmospheres like Earth or other places might have, you certainly need a little more aerodynamic type of vehicle. And the saucer has the capability of going through the air at tremendous rates of speed and handling the bow and trailing wave without making shock waves. So it can be very silent while traveling at big rates of speed through the atmosphere. A friend of mine who was a captain on a major airline at night was flying along, noticed this. Suddenly a big glow came off his left wing, and he looked out and this big saucer was sitting right off their wing. And so he turned slightly toward and it moved away, and turned back and it moved back in position, and turned to his co-pilot and said, do you see what I see? And he said, oh God, yeah, I do. And it trailed along with him for quite a period of time, then tipped up, climbed very steeply away. Was on Jim McDivitt's Gemini 7 mission, where they saw this glint of something metallic off in the distance. And he reported it, and nobody had it listed on the ground, so he tried getting a picture of it, but the sun, unfortunately, was glinting off of it so bright. All you got is just a glint. There was no detail on what it was, but never any further sighting at all on it. Well, the letter to the UN was in conjunction with a meeting that I had with Kurt Waldheim and the Security Council of the UN to try to encourage the UN to establish a committee to start comparing notes and data and information, and to really look into all of this from an unbiased, neutral point of view.
Here's a quote from your letter. I believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles and their crews are visiting this planet from other planets and are obviously a little more advanced than we are here on Earth. And are you saying that's exactly why governments have been trying to keep this information private, because of that obvious advancement?
Very possibly, right.
I looked out the window and observed this light moving at a very excessive speed, in excess of 600 knots, coming at the helicopter. It looked like a locked-on missile.
A family of 5 in a car observed the strange red object on a collision course with Colonel Coyne's helicopter. They pulled off the road to watch.
The thing that makes this particular evening a unique experience was that it was almost a mid-air collision with an object that you know as a UFO. We did not know it was such until it was on top of the helicopter, and that took just a matter of minutes.
Colonel Coyne put the helicopter into a dive to try to avoid impact. When he and his crew looked up, the object was keeping pace with them.
While it was in this position, the green light came out from the undercarriage of the UFO.
Colonel Coyne cut the power and set the controls for a steep dive. In spite of this, the helicopter was pulled upward toward the UFO from an altitude of 1,700 feet to an altitude of above 3,700 feet. Colonel Coyne and his crew observed the strange UFO at close range for approximately 2 minutes.
The object that I viewed that particular evening had a high degree of technology. It was composed of a structure and a design that we do not have. The object can move through the atmosphere without causing any turbulence. It can move at high speeds below 10,000 feet. There are no vertical or horizontal stabilizers, no landing gear, no source of propulsion reflected on the craft. Looks like it could fly in space.
This is Major Coyne, Army helicopter pilot. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Arrigo Jetsi, Air Medic Sergeant Healy, and Robert Janicek. These men had just finished their annual flight physical early that day and were found fit and sound of mind. They would take off from Port Columbus Airport about 10:30 p.m. But what was about to follow, and the subsequent report they filed, would put to the test the credibility of these men.
Approximately 8 miles east of Mansfield, our crew chief, Sergeant Robert Janicek, observed a red light on the east horizon.
Did you gentlemen see the same red light?
Yes, I did. Our helicopter was flying on a northerly heading. We were flying at an altitude of 2,500 feet. He indicated that the light seemed to be pacing the helicopter, moving along in a parallel direction with our aircraft.
Which direction from the helicopter was it at?
Moving, it was to our right, to the right side of the helicopter. And it was moving with us as we were heading north towards Cleveland. And at this time, he indicated that the light changed its direction and was coming directly at the helicopter at the same altitude. And as the helicopter was maintaining a speed of 90 knots, the object came at a terrific speed from the horizon. We estimated 15 miles. Visibility was reported 15 miles that night.
Did you gentlemen see the object at this time, after it had been pointed out by the sergeant?
No, not at that time. I was flying left seat or co-pilot, and visibility from that seat from an object approaching from the right is rather limited. So I was having difficulty seeing the object. And it was for that reason that Major Coyne did take the aircraft or the controls from me.
I grabbed the controls from Lieutenant Jetsi because I thought it was going to hit us. I braced for impact. With that, I pushed the collective down to get the helicopter to start to descend. I then looked at the altimeter. It was showing 1,700 feet, and we were descending 1,000 feet a minute. The helicopter began to descend, and as this object came at the helicopter, it seemed to descend with the helicopter. When the helicopter went down, the object came down, but it still came directly at our broadside, as if to hit the helicopter from the right side.
Did anyone else see the object at this time?
Yes, I was watching it come on out of the east horizon. And the only thing I felt was when the skipper took over the controls and we started to auto-rotate down, and I'd never been involved in a mid-air collision, so I was just watching this thing come at us.
It was at this time a light swung 90 degrees from the UFO towards the helicopter, and it came in through the front of the plexiglass, and the entire cabin inside turned green from the light. It was a pyramid-shaped type light that beamed down and came through the front of the helicopter.
How long was your aircraft bathed in this beam?
The light that came into the cockpit apparently lasted only for a few seconds, but it was enough time that I observed the red instrument panel lights utilized for night flying to be absorbed by the green light.
Was it possible for you to determine the outline of this object against the star background?
Yes, sir. It was a cigar-shaped object, like a symmetrical airfoil with the dome on it. It was a solid object. It was a metallic structure to it. And you could see lights reflecting off the structure, and you could not see any of the stars or behind the object itself.
Well, while all this was going on, what was the attitude of the helicopter?
Apparently, when we were supposed to be descending at 2,000 feet a minute at 100 knots, we were climbing at 1,000 feet a minute with the controls still established for a descent. And we went from 1,700 feet up to 3,500 feet and topped out at 3,800 feet. I would like to stress one important fact, and that is there is approximately 20 years of Army aviation experience between the 4 men on board the helicopter that night. We have been trained to follow procedures and regulations in reporting incidents, regardless of how they're accepted. And we tried to follow those procedures. And we reported the incident as it occurred and have avoided any speculation on the subject.
In 1973, when I was vice president at Gray Advertising, and I took time out and went to Norton Air Force Base to explore subjects for television specials related to the Defense Department. While discussing several of the subjects, UFOs came up, and Paul here told us about a film of a landing of alien crafts at Holloman Air Force Base about 3 years earlier.
What did you see, Mr. Shuttle?
I saw footage of 3 disc-shaped crafts. One of the craft landed and 2 of them went away.
Why did it land?
It appeared to be in trouble because it oscillated all the way down to the ground. However, it did land on 3 pods. A sliding door opened, a ramp was extended, and out came 3 aliens.
What did they look like?
Well, they were human-sized. They had odd gray complexion and a pronounced nose. They wore tight-fitting jumpsuits, thin headdresses that appeared to be communication devices, and in their hands they held a translator, I was told. A Holloman base commander and other Air Force officers went out to meet them.
You actually saw these aliens on the film?
Yes.
This film footage sounded very, very special, and we wanted to use it as the ending of our television special.
And did you? Was it in your special?
Well, although the Pentagon had been very, very cooperative all the way, at the last minute the film was confiscated and we lost the whole finale of our show. But what I saw and heard was enough to convince me that, you know, the phenomenon of UFOs is real, very real.
Mr. Shuttle, what did your superior officers tell you?
I was told it was theatrical footage the Air Force has purchased to make a training film.
Well, that sounds plausible, doesn't it?
Well, if it were a theatrical film, why didn't I have a record of this? It was my job to keep accurate records of all audiovisual purchases.
Is there any other reason that you feel this was not a theatrical film?
Yes, it was too real. The people who were shooting that day were Air Force personnel. Lucky for us, the day they were shooting, they were doing an acceleration test.
Yeah, well, it's too bad we couldn't get that footage from the Air Force. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today.
Then they put the documentary out, and then I find out that there's 8 seconds of the Holloman Air Force Base film in the film. So Bob's my friend. I phone him up, Bob, there's 8 seconds of film in there. And he goes, well, yeah. And I said, you told me they pulled the film. You told me it was sent back to the Pentagon. And he said, well, it did. And he told me this whole story about the guy going across the country in this small Datsun, taking the film back to the Pentagon. I said, but there's 8 seconds of film in the documentary. And then he said the key words. He said, but it didn't show anything. And I said, oh no, he said, it's background. And I said, background? What do you mean it's background? And he said, it didn't show anything. And what it is you see the hills of Holloman, and you see this object, this brilliantly lit object at 6 o'clock in the morning coming over the hills, but it's in a distance. So you don't see it close up, and you don't see the alien when the alien gets out. That's the classified part. So they want you to know that Holloman happened, and they allowed them to use the 8 seconds of the film, but the rest of the film, the classified part, was pulled.
Will you tell the truth to the American people about UFOs?
The CIA refuses.
The President of the United States doesn't have access to everything.
You have no need to know, even though you're the commander-in-chief.
Why is the president so interested in UFOs? October 1969. A young politician is leaving a fundraising event in Georgia when he spots a large, eerie object glowing in the evening sky.
When he looks up in the sky and he sees an object, it's an object that is big. It's bigger than the moon. And he thinks to himself, that's the darndest thing I ever saw.
There is no reasonable explanation for the strange object he is seeing in the sky. It truly is something he can't identify.
The guy who saw and reported the UFO was the future president of the United States, Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter is running for president, and he's asked on the campaign trail, Governor Carter, will you tell the truth to the American people about UFOs? And Jimmy Carter says, yes, I will. He's going to reveal the truth.
In 1977, when Carter wins the presidency, he directs the CIA to release top-secret reports on UFOs and extraterrestrial life. The CIA refuses.
Just flat out say no to the president, that's really something.
Carter tries another way.
Jimmy Carter asks the director of Central Intelligence, George H.W. Bush, Mr. Director, can you tell me what the CIA knows about UFOs? And George, consummate professional, says, Mr. President-elect, you have no need to know.
But something mysterious happens. Just as it seems a standoff is on the cards, Carter makes a U-turn, retracting his promise to declassify UFO documents and make key reports public. He cites a serious threat to national security as the reason for backing down.
President Carter never mentions the word UFO again.
It sounds suspicious, but there are some very sensible reasons why you don't release sensitive national security information.
NASA astronaut and test pilot Hoop Gibson has been involved in projects like these.
I do know as a test pilot that we have very highly classified projects that are flying, and I'll say where they're flying from. They're flying from Area 51. We know that this has been going on for years and years because such airplanes as the SR-71 Blackbird, the U-2, the stealth fighter, the F-117. Those all started life up in that area and flew from that spot. I would be very surprised if we don't still have secret, top secret, military prototype aircraft flying from there.
In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
Andy Danziger, nice to see you this morning.
Good morning.
Now, we should be clear that this incident that you saw happened in 1989. Why did it take so long for you to talk about it?
It was
There was no formal policy at my airline or any airline I've ever worked for that said not to talk about it, but it was kind of unwritten. We were young, we were new in our careers, and the way people tended to be ridiculed about all this, you just kind of kept quiet.
So this came out during a Daily News interview recently when you were asked about it.
That's correct.
Had you ever seen a UFO? And you responded that you had, and you went into detail about it. So what happened in 1989 on that day?
Unbelievable. We were flying from Kansas City to Waterloo, Iowa. I was just a first officer in a commuter airline turboprop. And crystal clear skies in Kansas City, crystal clear skies forecast in Waterloo. Supposed to be good weather en route. It's only a couple 250 miles away. We reached our cruise altitude of 15,000 feet, and all of a sudden we just noticed, you know, we're busy in the climb out. Those little, smaller airplanes didn't have autopilots. Leveled out, and a lot of thin, wispy clouds all around us. I noticed off to my right, and I was sitting in the right seat, was a white disc, just kind of thin, visible, barely visible behind the clouds, or dimly visible behind the clouds. And it was a little odd, but you know, we were used to seeing a lot of things in the sky, so when you see something strange, you start looking around trying to figure out what it is. And the first thing you think about is the moon, because it looked like it could have been the moon dimly visible, but the moon was out over here and it was a crescent, it wasn't a full moon. So it couldn't have been a reflection of the moon.
So this large disk, you described it as being pretty large.
Oh, yeah.
Massive. And then after a while, it was following you.
Or we were following it. It was pacing us.
It was pacing you. Then something unbelievable happened to its shape and its color. It turned into a giant orange ball glowing in the sky?
Yeah, after we'd been looking down for searchlights and stuff from the ground, maybe something shining up on the cloud, couldn't find anything. After about 40 minutes, we started our descent into Waterloo, and as we started our descent and looked up, here's this giant red ball just above the clouds.
Unbelievable.
Oh, it was.
And there were people, of course, who witnessed this on your plane as well, not just you at
No,
the time.
the captain that was on the plane did. I don't know about any of the passengers.
Like air traffic control, I've talked to a lot of pilots here off the air in commercial breaks, and I've asked them this question, we've talked about it, and they've all admitted that they've seen UFOs, but they kind of keep quiet about it. Why is it that they keep quiet about it? Is it fear of losing their job?
I don't know. It's you don't want to be brandished as being crazy. That was one of our concerns before we actually reported it to air traffic control. We discussed it amongst each other. Is this something that's going to jeopardize our career? The government discounts every single report that ever seems to come out. The news media tends to, or at least in the past, has tended to ridicule every UFO report. So, you know, that was all going on really big back in the 1980s.
Since you came forward, what have you heard from people? What have you heard from other pilots who have said thank you for speaking about this?
A little bit. I've got a few friends who've called me and said, wow, maybe this is going to finally get the stuff out. I've seen stuff, and it's about time that somebody came forward and you're actually getting some press, and maybe people will start believing this a little bit more.
I will now call to the podium a distinguished American, a man who is, in fact, someone who has the right stuff, which includes a doctorate in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT, selection to the NASA Apollo program, selection to a NASA Apollo program moon mission, selection to a NASA Apollo moon mission egress from the capsule on the moon, returning to our world to write several books, found the Institute of Nomadic Sciences, develop a number of scientific exploration initiatives. A man who has received far more awards than I could possibly list here, but which do include the Presidential Medal of Freedom nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize in a number of honorary doctorates. And he has some things to say to you this morning. I will ask him to come forward now. Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you very much for being here. My story with regard to the disclosure process is very simple. I grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, the site of the first UFO crash, the alleged UFO crash. And my story is as a result of growing up there. I was a senior in high school, just going into my senior year in 1947, when on one day the Roswell Record announced that an alien craft had crashed, and the next day changed that story and said no, the Air Force said that was a weather balloon. And since I was on my way to college and more interested in those things, I didn't pay much attention to it at that point in time. However, my family was in the agribusiness. My grandfather was a cattle buyer and sold registered Hereford bulls to the ranchers in the area, knew everybody in the area, in the Pecos Valley and beyond, sold cattle into Arizona, western Texas, and was affectionately known as Bull Mitchell in those parts. And so it was not unsurprising to me later on that the lore of the area, of our friends and the people in Roswell, including the Sheriff's Department, and a military friend of ours, a major, who was also turned out to be a friend of Jesse Marcel, who was the first Air Force officer on the site of the crash. And this Air Force officer was in administration. He was not really involved, but he eventually told me his story, and that's how I became involved. So after my Apollo flight, I did very little. I knew nothing but the lore of the region up until that point. But after my Apollo flight, when I was back in the area and visiting relatives and friends, some of the people in the area who had been involved, what I call the old timers, who were involved in the 1940s, 1947, and subsequent with the Roswell crash, and people like in the Sheriff's Department who had been to the crash site and were supervising traffic. My friend and friend of our family, the Major, who was an office mate of in the administrative function at Walker Air Force Base. These folks, because they had been shushed and told not to talk about their experience by military authority in those days, and on dire consequence if they did, felt that here in the 70s, many years later, that they didn't want to go to the grave with their story. They wanted to tell somebody reliable. And being a local boy and having been to the moon, they considered me reliable enough to whisper in my ear their particular story and their association with the Roswell crash, including the family of the undertaker who provided coffins for the alleged alien victims, and others on site who had been involved or knew the story. And of course, eventually I ran into Jesse Marcel Jr., the son of the Jesse Marcel, who was the first military officer on the site, and knew his story, and knew his story well, and we became friends in later years in this disclosure movement. And at some point, about 10 years ago, and I can't remember what date it was right now, when the disclosure movement was going strongly, I came here to Washington with a Navy commander by the name of Will Miller and Dr. Stephen Greer, and we were able to get an appointment at the Pentagon to talk about what we knew, or what we allegedly knew, what we thought we knew, and went and told our story. And the powers that be at the Intelligence Committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff listened to our story and said, the Admiral said, well, I don't know that story. I don't know that that's true, but I will find out. So we departed, went on our way, and subsequently learned through Dr. Greer and through Will Miller, and that those stories had been confirmed and that the Admiral had been denied access when he tried to get into the inner workings of that process. And we had confirmation of that, although that Admiral now denies the fact that this is a fact. So my story is essentially that. I do have no first-hand experience with the ET effort, except the fact that I know all of these research people that you'll hear from today, and some who are not here today, who have spent a long amount of their lives and time doing research into the alien visitation, UFO crashes, and so forth. And I urge that those who are doubtful read the books, read the lore, and start to understand what has really been going on, because there is no doubt we are being visited. And as a person who is a part of the first generation of being a spacefarer of our civilization and having gone to the moon, and realizing that I do, and many of us do now, that have seen the Hubble pictures from space, the universe that we live in is much more wondrous, exciting, complex, and far-reaching than we were ever able to know up to this point in time. And the fact we have wondered, were we alone in the universe forever? Only in our period do we really have evidence, no, we're not alone. We are just one planet with intelligent life on it, and probably it is time, now that we are spacefarers on our planet, that we get active, because we're really universal beings. And in the long stretch of things, if we think about it in the longest possible range, we realize, and I realize this from my studies in astronomy and astrophysics, our sun will burn out in due course, and we have to be off this planet if our species is to survive. So anybody, any species, any planet that is on around the mainstream star like ours is, only has a finite amount of time on that star before it burns out. And so our destiny, in my opinion, and we might as well get started with it, is become a part of the planetary community of nations, of planets, just like when we were much newer on this planet, and we found tribes over in the next valley or across the next mountains, and we started forming communities then and reaching out beyond ourselves. At this point in human history on this planet, we're now starting, and ready should be, to reach out beyond our planet and beyond our solar system to find out what is really going on out there. And the 20th and 21st century that we now live in, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution really didn't take off until the 19th century. And I tell the story to some of my younger audiences, particularly in schools, that my great-grandparents went across from South Georgia to West Texas in a covered wagon at the end of the Civil War in the 1870s. My family, my father's generation, was involved with going off the planet in aircraft. And less than 100 years later, I went to the moon. So some covered wagons to going to the moon in less than 100 years is a history of the development of our civilization in not our lifetime, but a couple of generations. And so it's time to start thinking in those terms. And particularly since now, in the 20th and 21st century, we suddenly find that due to our expertise and our genius in science and technology, we have exploded our population from under 2 billion at the beginning of the 20th century to over 6.5 billion at this point. And our consumption patterns are clearly indicating that we are utilizing our non-renewable resources at an unacceptable rate, a non-sustainable rate. So we've got a lot of thinking to do about what being an advanced civilization really means. But let's put all that aside for a moment, because we're here to talk about disclosure. And what I am suggesting is it is now time to put away this embargo of truth about the alien presence. And I call upon our government to open up like other governments have, and you will hear about that this morning. Like the Belgians have, the French have, the Brazilians have, the Argentines, the Mexicans have all released their files. It's about time now that we do the same thing and become a part of this planetary community that is now trying to take our proper role as spacefaring civilization. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, now, would any of the media like to ask either of these gentlemen a question at this point? Any of the reporters?
Yeah.
Alan?
Can you tell us, Dr. Mitchell, exactly what the locals of Roswell told you, if you could remember specifics?
On the mic.
Yeah.
The essence was that the Roswell event was an alien craft, that it was not of this planet. That's the essence. What they really told me was their particular, each one had some particular part of it, like a sheriff's deputy was controlling traffic but heard from what the other people what was going on. The family of the undertaker told about the small coffins that were created for the alien bodies. And my Air Force family friend said yes, he had heard the same thing from Major Brazel. Each one of them just told what their portion of the activity was all about. So putting it all together, the sum total was, yes, it was an alien spacecraft.
Thank you.
Another question?
Just had another question about
Sure.
fellow astronauts talking to you about seeing space, UFOs in space.
No, I have talked to all of the astronauts up through the Apollo program. And the only ones that have had UFO experience were in their Air Force careers, where were vectored to chase a UFO, never quite made it, couldn't quite get them in their sights or whatever. And that was Deke Slayton, and Gordon Cooper had his experience that's been well recited about seeing one land at Edwards Air Force Base, seeing the pictures of it. Suddenly the pictures disappeared into the vaults of Washington and never returned. But the military people that had UFO experience were in their Air Force careers before the astronaut program. And of course, being a military and a Navy pilot myself, the stories among airline pilots and other pilots is they're just all over the places. And we're all told, shut up about it. I never chased one myself, but all my friends that did, where it was all the same thing, don't talk about it.
So this is something I feel like, if I was the president, and it's unlikely that that is ever going to happen.
You never know.
If I was the president...
It was unlikely that I was going to be president.
The moment I was inaugurated, my hand would just, it'd still be hot from touching the Bible, and I would immediately race to wherever they have the files about Area 51 and the UFOs, and I'd go through everything to find out what happened.
Right.
Did you do that?
That's why you will not be president. Because that's the first thing that you would do. The aliens won't let it happen. You reveal all their secrets. They exercise strict control over us.
Now, you know, there are a lot of people that are going to examine your facial expressions here, every twitch, everything, and say, and of course, so did you look? Did you see? Did you explore?
I can't reveal anything.
Oh, really? Because President Clinton said he did go right in, and he did check, and there was nothing.
Well, you know, that's what we're instructed to say.
All right.
Before you leave office, will you let us know if there's aliens? Because this is the only thing I really want to know. I want to know what's going on. Would you ever open up Roswell and let us know what's really going on there?
So many people ask me that question.
I know, it sounds almost ridiculous, but it's actually the real question I want to know.
It sounds like a cute question, but it's actually, there are millions and millions of people that want to go there, that want to see it. I won't talk to you about what I know about it, but it's very interesting. But Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
So you're saying you may declassify?
Oh.
You'll take it?
Well, I'll have to think about that one, right?
Reggie, do you have a question for our guest this evening?
Yes, I do. Tonight's question is... Hello.
Hi.
With the recent release of Pentagon footage of unidentified aerial phenomena and things like Project Blue Book and ATIP and all of these various things, in your former position and currently with the current information that's released, what's your viewpoint on what these objects that seem to defy all laws of physics are?
Well, first of all, that's a legitimate question now. And the short answer, but not the most meaningful one, is I don't know about this. But when I was president and I had a chief of staff, John Podesta, who loved science fiction, we made every attempt to find out everything about Roswell. And we also sent people to Area 51 to make sure there were no aliens in a deep, because Area 51 is very important.
Who do you send to Area 51?
Oh, if I told you that. No, actually, I sent my Sandy Berger, who passed away sadly a couple of years ago, who was my national security advisor. But I said, we got to find out how we're going to deal with this, because that's where we do a lot of our invisibility research in terms of technology. Like, how do we fly airplanes that aren't picked up by radar and all that? So that's why they're so secretive. But there's no aliens, as I know. On the other hand, Hillary and I went to Hawaii in 2018 to the Big Island, where all the telescopes are on top of the mountain, you know, including the Keck telescope, the largest in the world. And several countries have scientific teams there. So after we toured the telescope, we went down and met with them. And I said, do you guys argue about the likelihood of life in outer space? He said, we have huge arguments. I said, you do? He said, oh, huge. I said, what's the range? He said, there are those of us who think it's 85% likely, and those of us who think it's 95%. He said, these are people who spend their lives doing this. He said, we think, in other words, it's very unlikely that there is not life. There are a billion, not a billion planets, a billion solar-like systems. There are lots of mysteries out there, which is why I think we should take good care of this planet. I think we ought to kind of hang on to it if we can. And I think, but I also think it should keep us humble. There's a lot of stuff we don't know.